Osage are the finest, wealthiest, and most beautiful people on God's earth. They outsmarted everybody. They have the say who gets the oil. Son, you like women? Well, we mix these families together, and that estate money flows the right direction. It'll come to us.
Shomikasi. That's how you are.
I don't know what you said, but it must have been Indian for handsome devil.
Why did you come here?
I work with my uncle.
You scared of him?
Oh, he's the nicest man in the world. The Osage.
Their time is over.
We have so many deaths we've lost count.
It's just bad luck.
Seems more like an epidemic than bad luck to me.
Osage is dying by the enemy. Do not let them die alone.
Don't do something you're going to regret for the rest of your life.
I ain't got nothing but regret.
Hi, I'm Heath Firestone with CinemaTechnica.
And hi, I'm Mark Loftus, editor of Post Magazine.
Today we're actually going to be talking about the new Martin Scorsese film, Killers of the Flower Moon. Do you want to start this off, Mark?
Yeah, I'll tell you a little bit about it. It's an Apple original film, and Killers of the Flower Moon is based on a book by David Gran. I haven't read the book, so I don't know how close the film ties to it, but apparently the story is based in truth on the story of the Osage Indian Nation, which takes place in the late 1800s, early 1900s. They kind of migrated from, I believe it was Missouri to Oklahoma, and they ended up on this oil-rich land, which made them, per capita, some of the richest people on the planet because they're a small Indian nation and they had these huge oil reserves. That being said, because they were home to so much oil, there was a lot of jealousy, I guess, and interest in taking what they felt wasn't maybe necessarily theirs to have, by the white man. So that's kind of a little bit of a backstory on the film. Again, it is based on truth, and it's a bit of a love story too, which is
kind of.
yeah, which is kind of an interesting approach to it. Apple describes it as an epic Western crime saga. That's how they're kind of branding it. The film runs 3.5 hours, so there's a lot of storytelling in it, and we can talk about the length and practicality of that later on. But so that's a little bit of a background on what to expect if you're not familiar with the story and the backstory of it.
So yeah, let's talk first about the length, because that's going to be the most obvious thing that's a sticking point for a lot of people. It is hard to go to a theater and sit through a 3.5 hour film. And I assume it's released first in the theaters and later on Apple Plus. Is that correct?
Yeah, my understanding is that ultimately it'll be a theatrical release to begin with, and then released streaming. I would imagine it'll be on one of the Apple, the Apple platforms or iTunes or something for you to view it that way. But you're right. As far as the length, you and I got to see screenings prior to the release. The release is October 20th. You and I got to see it a week or so ago, leading up to the release. And when they do these private screenings, you literally go into a theater and they start the film, and there's no coming attractions, there's no commercials or anything like that. When you go to a commercial theater, that could be an extra half hour. So now you're talking a 3.5 hour experience into a 4-hour experience. So I'm not opposed to long films if I know that going into it. I kind of like to be prepared, knowing that, hey, when is this film going to, wrap up? I try to, be open to that. But you kind of have to be mentally prepared for something that long. And I know that in the past, there was an economics of why films were the length that they were. I worked for United Artists in the theater business in the 90s, and films were an hour and 20 minutes, an hour and 40 minutes. And back then you were looking at film as a distribution format, so there was an expense in distributing these films to the different theaters and who got the films. And even with the production, you're shooting film. These days, most films are shot digitally, but in this case, it was shot primarily on film with some digital segments, and we can talk a bit about that. So From a production standpoint, there was an expense in shooting on film. But what are your thoughts on the length of it? And you knew going into it how long it was going to be.
Yeah, Mark saw it, at least a week before I did, because you went to the New York premiere, right?
That's right. I went to the red carpet premiere in New York City, which was exciting because Martin Scorsese is there. Thelma Schoonmaker is there, the editor, who's won, many Oscars working with Martin Scorsese. Members of the Osage Nation were there. The acting talent wasn't necessarily there. Robert De Niro, Leonardo DiCaprio.
Oh, because of the strike.
Lily Gladstone, they were not in attendance because of the strike. I guess they're not allowed to promote it. But still, it was an exciting time. It was well attended. It was probably 1,000 people there because it was in one of these big theaters at Lincoln Center. So, yeah, it was exciting to be a part of that. But, yeah, we got to see it a little bit before the release, and I knew going in it was going to be long, so I kind of, made a mental note of that, and I shared that with you too. But what are your thoughts on that from?
Yeah, if you go see it at the theater, use the restroom right before you go in. Yeah. But I will say that the pacing of the movie is slow enough that if you had to get up and use the restroom halfway through, you may not miss anything important.
Okay. Yeah. There is it's a long story, and you're right. You could kind of duck out for maybe a few minutes and not necessarily miss any of the.
Whereas with the creator, if you stepped out to use the restroom, you'd miss some important things and get really confused because you're already trying to track a lot. This it's a much slower pace than that. In fact, I made a joke to Mark that this movie, I think, could have been an hour less, and I kind of wish they had taken that hour and given it to the creator, which needed more time to tell its story. So.
Could you imagine that? Yes, I'd like to donate some of the time from this movie to another, fan favorite or something. But it
was a good movie. I do want to clarify, it was a good movie. I read a couple of reviews where people said that he needed 3.5 hours to tell his story. I totally disagree. There were, and it's interesting. Even I was reading some stuff that the editor was saying, and she says that she loves working with Martin Scorsese because he doesn't like to repeat himself and stuff like this. And that's not really true in this case. I mean, especially when it came to one of the murders. We see the murder earlier, we see the aftermath of the murder, then we see the murder in the trial, and then we see a recreation of the murder from a different angle. And it really wasn't necessary. And there was actually contradictions in the different retellings of it, that actually kind of affects some of the story things. So I don't know. I mean, to me, that that's the type of thing where less would have been more, because he could have cut out the retellings and the stuff that contradicted and that sort of thing. It wasn't necessary.
I know what you're saying, and that does add to the length of a film when you do it that way. I'm not one to criticize Martin Scorsese. He obviously knows what he's doing, and he had a story that he was looking to tell. And obviously, all of the films that he's done in the past, I'm a fan of Casino, and Goodfellas, and all these other great films. But can anybody tell him it doesn't have to be that length?
Well,
I don't know.
That's the problem, though. I think once you get to a certain point, sometimes you maybe have a little bit too much leeway, and you take you aren't as careful about making some of these decisions because you're this great thing. Nobody's going to question why you made it longer than it had to be. But the thing is, I mean, granted, there were only like 20 or so people in the theater when I went to see it, but it was generally the consensus of everybody there that this movie did not have to be as long as it was. And these are mostly Martin Scorsese fans. And I like Scorsese's stuff. I'm not trying to say that I'm a better editor than his Oscar-winning editor or better director, but I do recognize when a dead horse is being beaten. And so so. I know I'll probably get lots of comments, but I mean that's my opinion.
Well, again, just going back to the story of this. So again, we're talking about the Osage Indians. They have this land that is, that they occupy that is rich in oil. Robert De Niro plays William Kinghale, and he's kind of a local businessman. He's not really a mayor, but he has the reach of a mayor where he can influence banking and doctors and landowners and stuff like that. And he obviously is jealous of the Indians' ownership of this land. He feels that, hey, he's in the area and it should be open to his people as well.
He's an opportunist,
Yeah, he's an opportunist. For sure. And Leonardo DiCaprio plays, I think it's his nephew, Ernest, who had just gotten out of the war. He's kind of looking for a job. He moves to the area and he puts them together. He's like, puts them into a job, getting them like as a taxi driver. And again, this is like the 1920s. So they're driving these open canopy Ford Model T type cars. And
I think they're Pace Arrows or something like that. I don't know.
Okay.
So during this time, because the Osage Nation actually purchased their own reservation or whatever when they moved to Oklahoma. This is a little historical background on it. And because of that, they actually owned the mineral rights to that. And it was really not a good place to live. It was considered really, really poor land until, they discovered oil on it. And then they became like the richest people per capita, in the country or whatever, So
in the world, I think they said, yeah.
Yeah, probably, yeah. So, but with that came a lot of people, because they got 10% of the royalties on all the oil that was collected, but how the money was dispersed was through guardianship stuff, and it was just, it's like, it was really messed up, and it had a lot of opportunity for people to come in and try to take advantage of it. And so you had a lot of people come in and marry into the tribes, and then ultimately be able to get a hold of some of that money through.
And that's kind of how the story rolls out, though. So Lily Gladstone plays Molly, and she's one of the members of the Osage Nation, and Ernest is driving this cab, and she's using him to kind of shuttle her around, do her business throughout the town, and they strike up a friendship. And there's kind of a knowledge, like you mentioned there, that she realizes that she is desirable because of who she is, her relationship in the Indian Nation, the land ownership, and that they're rich. And she knows that there will be suitors that are looking to, catch her eye, maybe in the interest of scoring some of that money and some of that land. So she's cautious when she's introduced to Ernest. And we know that Ernest kind of has that interest also because his uncle, William King Hale, is kind of telling him, hey, these are rich people. It would be right for you to, pursue one of them. So they both are understanding of it, but yet they do have a genuine affection for each other.
And that's the thing. He's pretty upfront about, kind of some of his intentions, So, I mean, you can't really fault him for that. He says these are some of my failings. And yes, I love money, but he actually does develop a genuine affection for her. And, you do believe throughout the story that he does love her. But it's very complicated because he's also part of some really horrible things. And he's not a good person. That's one of the biggest challenges I had with the film. Halfway through the film, I'm like, I don't like any of these characters. I mean, I kind of like, Lily Gladstone's character, Molly, kind of, I mean, she's nice enough. She's interesting, but, there's no obvious person that you're really meant to connect with, I don't think, and she's not that big of a presence in it, so, and it's not even an anti-hero where you can like the bad guy, so both Leonardo DiCaprio and Robert De Niro do excellent jobs in their parts, but William King Hale, they call him the King of the Osage, or he likes to be called King, which is played by Robert De Niro, is a very charismatic character, but purely evil.
Yeah.
And he makes everybody believe that he cares about them, and he may even care about them to some extent, but they're all just tools for him. Even his own nephew, you ultimately find out, and you can't really like him even as a bad guy just because. So I don't know. It's hard to find that person to connect with, and that's tricky.
I know what you're talking about in the sense of Robert De Niro's character, William King Hale. You're right. You look at past characters that he's been in Casino, where he's a mob boss running a casino, and he wasn't really doing the right thing, but he was a likable character. And you look at Goodfellas, and he treated Henry well, and he seemed to be looking out for him. So even though he was a crime boss, again, you kind of were accepting of that. But in this film, he was just a sleazy guy that was using everybody for his own enrichment there. His own nephew, he was disturbing people's relationships. People were dying, so it wasn't just greed. People were actually dying on it. Going back to Lily Gladstone and her Molly character, she's likable in the sense that you feel compassionate for her because she is a victim, essentially. And everybody did a great job in their role. And I sat in on a Martin Scorsese Q&A where he talked about making the film. And he said one of the first shots that they filmed was that scene where Leonardo DiCaprio and Lily are meeting each other, Molly and Ernest, kind of for the first time. And Ernest pulls over because he wants to watch the horse race. And she's like, "Oh, do you have any money in it?" And, they're trying to figure each other out.
Actually, it was a car race in the movie, but
was it a car race? Okay.
Yeah.
And she says something in her native Indian language, and he says, "I don't know what you said, but I wouldn't be surprised if you said, 'Damn, he's a handsome young fella,' or something like that." And that was apparently ad-libbed. And when you see Lily Gladstone laughing, it was genuine because of the reaction to it. So that was like right from Martin Scorsese on filming. So that was one of the, the beginning scenes that they had shot. But go ahead. I mean, do you want to talk about the production or you want to talk more story?
Well, yeah. So I guess both. It was interesting because I guess the original version of the story, when Scorsese was working on adapting it, is they were actually going to not focus on Ernest as the main character, but rather what would become the FBI, I guess the Bureau of Investigation or whatever, and that story is going to be more of a true crime thing and investigating this whole thing, which would have been a very different story. And we don't really get any of that until about halfway through the movie or so, which those characters were the first characters I actually felt like I could kind of relate to because they're good guys, Well,
they were seeking the truth. Yeah, they were seeking the truth. They didn't have the influence as to who owned the land, whose greed was, driving things. They were just looking to find out what was going on here. And you see that in the one scene where they knock on the door and Ernest answers. He's like, "Yeah, we're looking into these murders." He's like, "What about them?" He's like, "Well, we want to know who did them." It's like, this may be normal for what's going on in your neighborhood, but, outside of this area, we pursue, crime.
25 deaths is a big deal,
Yeah.
But I mean, that was one of the things that was interesting about it is how people didn't really seem to care that much about the deaths of Indians. And we think, well, this isn't back in the 1800s. This is in the, early 20th century. This is after World War I. And this is during a time that my grandparents were alive, and to think that it was, still that backwards. I mean, I guess, we've seen that progress even through, there was some instances in the 70s and that sort of thing, which Martin Scorsese says that he had an interest in some of what was happening with Indian nations back from 1974 when he visited, what was it he visited?
Yeah, you're right. It does date back into, I think, 74. Like you said, he made his first trip out to one of the Indian reservations and kind of knew of the stories there, but really didn't pursue it until more recently. I think 2019, he went and met with Osage Indians, found out more with them, ate with them, learned more about the culture, and presented them with the idea that he wanted to do it in a respectful but truthful way. And, tried. And they were, concerned and conservative about how this would be dealt with, but ultimately it moved forward. And
again, this is during a time when, the KKK actually were in parades and that sort of thing and unmasked, and you could be a prominent member of society and be it was okay that you're in KKK. So you realize how different a time it really was, and it's just like, to me it seems like that stuff was further back, but I guess it wasn't really. And I don't know, that always throws me, I guess.
Yeah, right. It's the 1920s that this is taking place, so it's not, it's 100 years ago, yes, but it
also felt like the Old West, so it didn't seem like 20th century. But Martin Scorsese says he's always been influenced by and loved old westerns, and so he always wanted to do a western. So this is his first actual western, and it has that feel. It has that wide open spaces. I guess from a production standpoint, even in the city, they had to find a town that actually could be modified enough that it could actually look more like that time period. But they actually had to cover the streets with dirt to make it look like it was from that time period, when obviously the streets that were actually have been paved since then.
Yeah,
but
and that gets us into visual effects. So maybe we can talk a little bit about the production, and some of the challenges for it. The cinematographer who has worked with Martin Scorsese in the past is Rodrigo Prieto. and he's worked with him on a number of films, including The Irishman most recently. And it was interesting because this film was shot on film, which is kind of an interesting decision. Apparently he shot with Aricam LT and Aricam ST for the majority of the film. And then the nighttime scenes were shot with the Sony Venice camera. So there was a little bit of a difference there. And there are nighttime scenes in it. So, I mean, a substantial amount, but kind of a
You don't
mix.
notice a big difference. And they tried to match it as best they could so that you wouldn't be able to tell. It did have that film feel to it. So, it's not that common that we actually film these days. Another interesting point, kind of on that same, and we can go back to this if you want, but there were like over 700 effects shots in it. And when you're watching it, you're not feeling like you're seeing any effects shots, which is a good thing. You shouldn't see the effects things. But when you think about it, I'm like, so what were the effects? Because I didn't know. And sometimes it was, adding in oil rigs in the background, but some of it was adding in crowds. And so there were more people in the background than you thought. And it's like, oh yeah, I guess, and I think a lot of stuff was removing modern elements to make it, so you don't see those things because you had to shoot around these. So that's the type of effect you want in a period piece, is ones that you don't even know are there. They're just things that make you believe that you're filming it in that time period, I guess.
Yeah. The visual effects supervisor was Pablo Hellman, who, oversaw the visual effects, 700 shots. I know that ILM contributed visual effects to the film. Like you said, you had to harken back to the 1920s, so you had to make these city scenes look less modern. I would imagine it's removing signage and telephone poles and things like that.
Right.
The visual effects also included set extensions and obviously populating crowds. And you would think, yeah, you're using digital characters in a film like this, but yep, that was the case. They did use digital characters for it. So that was kind of interesting there.
Yeah, it felt like they were doing things the old-fashioned way where everything was pretty much real. But, it's like that's, I guess, where things have gotten to this point is that, you don't necessarily have to. Yeah, you're still using stuff that used to be just in Lord of the Rings and stuff like that, where you had to add in crowds, are now being used in everything. And it's interesting, I guess.
Yeah, historically, accurate type of films. One thing that I wanted to mention on that was going back to on the production side of thing. Not only the cameras that we mentioned, the Arri camera and the Aricam rather, and the Sony Venice, but he also used a hand crank camera from 1917 that Martin Scorsese owns, a Bell and Howard hand crank camera. So that's period correct camera for shooting the newsreel type of sequences there. So that was kind of interesting too.
Yeah, there were definitely some interesting choices with that, and it's cool that you can actually mix these different things for that effect and make it all work together. But speaking of things that were a little more jarring, the very end of the film switches gears completely. You go from this thing that looks like a Western throughout, and we talk about the coloring. They actually adjusted the colors depending on who they had as to which color scheme they wanted to use to bring out stuff. Whenever they showed Lily Gladstone's character, they went with really natural colors. But at the very end, the whole thing cuts to radio. I don't know, what do they call them? Teleplays or whatever, radio.
Like a live radio
drama,
radio show.
Which I think actually existed. I think that's maybe where the story was originally told. I think it was harkening back to that. Put on by J. Edgar Hoover, True Crimes of the FBI or something like that, where they actually talked about this. And it's pretty jarring because everything's done Technicolor style, so the colors are really vibrant. So you went from this kind of muted palette or very natural looking thing to this super bright. And I don't know. It was interesting. Definitely got mixed reactions from the people I watched it with.
Yeah, you're right about the color schemes. Like you said, the Molly's character was always very natural in colors. Ernest and King's colors were more muted in a case like that. But then take that 90% of the film, and then that last sequence there where it becomes this radio show is very vibrant. It's very different than what you've been watching for 3 hours at that point. So that was a little bit different. On the editing side, I wanted to talk a little bit about the editing side because that's part of it there too. Thelma Schoonmaker has worked with Martin Scorsese for 50 years. And I saw her at the New York screening, and I got to talk to her briefly. And I said, Robert De Niro has worked with Scorsese on 10 films. I think Leonardo DiCaprio has worked with him on 6 films. I said, where are you in the mix of this? And she said, 22. She's worked with him on 22 films, according to her. And she won 3 Oscars, all of them for Scorsese films, Raging Bull, The Departed, The Aviator. And she acknowledged I saw a YouTube video of her Departed when she won her speech. She goes, it's great working with Martin Scorsese. It's like film school. You're always learning. And she goes, and I recognize that I would not be here holding the Oscar if it were not for my partnership with him. And like you had said, just his style of, he doesn't want to tell the audience what they should be thinking. He wants them kind of to derive it based on what's going on. And sometimes it is this jumpy type of thing where you're watching a scene and the next thing you know, a murder has happened. And you're like, whoa, where did that come from? How do I feel about it and stuff? So
Right.
her style, she said, is reflective of that in this film.
Well, yeah, and there were definitely a couple instances of that, at least, where, and there was such a casual approach from the community to it. I mean, the people who were directly related will get really upset, but there weren't investigations into these things, and it's like that there wasn't the care. It's certainly by society or whatever. For the Indians.
With all of these murders and stuff, there was, obviously we're looking at the 1920s here, so attitudes were a lot different back then, and you had this attitude that, hey, these Indians are on land that maybe we should be tapping into the oil for, so there may be some resentment there, and when people started dying, maybe people turned their backs to it, to the reality of it, or maybe they knew. This was a small town, everybody knew King Hale. Did they know he was involved in this? I mean, you would think that the medical professionals did. You would think that the bankers and the funeral home and stuff, they all had some insight into what was going on there.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, they were all on the take, really. They were all in King's pocket for sure. He would get them to do up false reports and stuff because on the health of people who he had insured, so that he could collect the insurance on them. When they died. Some of these people were being poisoned, they're being shot, they're being, all sorts of stuff. It was pretty horrible all around. But you hear the cold, calculating justification that King gives for doing these things. It's like, they're sickly people. They don't live past 50 anyway. These people, this is a dying, breed or whatever he said, and indicating that he's just helping them along.
Right, because they're not going to live long enough to take advantage of this wealth, so you should somehow marry them and let this wealth transfer to your ownership. You're right. He was trying to sell Ernest on that idea that it's in the best interest in the longevity of their bloodline to do that, and I think that's what drives people to be more compassionate towards Molly, because she's really a victim, and there is a genuine love between Ernest and Molly. And I didn't think that Ernest was trying to do anything nefarious to her, as much as he was involved in all these other things. I think that there was a true relationship between them. And I think that she realized that even though there are people that are after her money, that this guy seems to have genuine feelings. So you kind of put aside all the stuff that's going on around them to think that this is, genuine between the two of them, but it's just terrible what's going on there with the medication and her family just being taken away from her piece by piece. Ultimately, her children. I mean, it's terrible.
And it is, and it's a good movie. It's an important story. It's hard to watch. You're very frustrated, if not angry, for large portions of the movie. You have a hard time. You should be angry. I think that's kind of the point of it. One of the guys who was watching it with me at the screening, we talked about it later, and then I watched his review, and he made a really interesting point. He said for him, this movie was not worth sitting in the theater for 3.5 hours for, because he was angry throughout the entire thing for the entire 3.5 hours. He said that's a lot to ask of people, to be angry for 3.5 hours. he said, he would recommend watching this when it comes out on Apple TV Plus, because there you can break it up. You can get up and use the restroom, or if you need a break from all the anger you're feeling or frustration or whatever, you can come back and still get through the whole story, but in more manageable pieces, I guess.
I wonder if that changes yeah, I mean, does that change the experience, though? Is the experience that you're supposed to take it in all at once and have a feeling at the end of it because you've taken it in? Or if you start breaking it down into chapters or more manageable pieces, does it ultimately change what the filmmaker wanted you to feel at the end of it? So you could look at it either way there.
That's a really good question, and I don't know if he's right about that, but it was an interesting point to bring up.
Yeah, definitely.
It depends on what your tolerance for being frustrated or angry or both, for such a long period is.
Yeah. I wonder going into it, like if they just told Martin Scorsese, you have carte blanche, make it as long as you need to make it. I know that he's trying to be respectful of the Osage Nation, and maybe you don't want to cut anything that you feel, is part of telling their story. So I can understand it from that standpoint, but I don't know if ultimately the final film would have been any less successful by maybe trimming it a little bit. But again, I'm not.
I mean, there were definitely times in the movie where I was like, okay, this is being held too long. You've already told us this. I mean, like I say, and that's just my opinion, but if I'm feeling it, it means probably a lot of other people are too. And I got that feedback from some of the other people who were watching the screening with me too. I think most everybody felt like there were areas that drug out or were repeated that didn't need to be repeated. Mm-hmm. There's this cool fire effect they have at one point, which I really like the fire effect, but it would have been cool if I saw it twice, and you see it like 6 times. And it's just like, okay.
I felt like
I get it.
I think I'd said to you offline, I think the scene that I'd like to see a little more of is similar to what happened when Molly's mom passed away, and she kind of gets up out of bed and moves on to the next realm. You don't realize that's what's going on until you cut to the next scene where they show her still laying in the bed. And then you say, okay, that must have been the Indian vision of what death is. I think I might have liked to have seen another example of that with, all of the deaths that had gone on in this film. Maybe it would have been interesting to see that, that storytelling device used a little more.
Yeah,
that's
they did use the owl symbolism or visualization, which I thought was actually really cool for this. But those are also in situations where the person was dying slowly. I don't know that they have the same belief that if something's going to happen abruptly and unexpectedly, that you would have that same precognition or whatever it be.
One thing that you and I kind of disagreed about was on Ernest and Molly's relationship with the diabetes and the medication that she was being administered. I came out of the film thinking that Ernest was giving her the medication with the intent of it helping her. Even though he could see she was declining, I think in his mind he thought that she has diabetes and I have to be giving her this insulin and somehow she's going to make a turn and going to get better. Okay. And you saw it differently than that.
I agree with you that he was giving her the insulin for that purpose. It was the stuff he was adding to it, which, we don't know if that was... it was suggested that it was kind of a sedative by King, that it was. When you actually do a little more research into it, I believe it's actually something slowly poisoning her, and that's why she was getting worse and worse when she was actually separated from that. So I didn't think it was the insulin that was an issue. I think it was the thing that he added. And he would struggle with deciding whether he was going to add that to the insulin or not. And at one point when he's really kind of down, he actually adds some to his own scotch and drinks some himself and sees how it affects him. And, it does affect him too. So, I mean, he's aware that he's giving her something that's not good for her, you know.
Right. You put together a lot of other scenes that I maybe overlooked in it. I kind of saw that ending scene where she's like, what was in, what were you administering to me? And he was like, insulin. I almost thought like he really thought he was giving them insulin, but you've brought up a couple of other points where, it was more than just that. And he was
guilty
to me, of making things worse. And I kind of... didn't see that. But when you point out those examples, you're right in that case. I wanted to believe that he was trying to do things that were best from her, as much as King was influencing her.
And you may still be right. And let me explain. The reason you might still be right is because she was starting to become a problem. She went to Washington to try to get the federal government to come and investigate the murders. She was becoming a problem. Even though she was slowly dying, she was, she was becoming a problem. And so by giving her this thing that sedated her and made her, less of a problem, he may not have been... He may not have realized that he was killing her, just thought that he was sedating her. He may have been, in essence, saving her from King just killing her outright.
That's true.
But, so there may be some to that. I think, it was interesting to see as the story went on and, she becomes painfully aware that Ernest was involved in actually, basically are complicit with, murdering her family. She still kind of stands by him, so it's like, wow, how could you, but I mean, it's complicated. You realize that she knew that he had greed and that he was under his, uncle's thumb, and he was kind of weak-willed. He wasn't very bright. He was easily manipulated, but he did care about her and she cared about him, and he did have a certain charm too. I mean, so he is a complex character, although not that likable in my opinion. But I don't know. He had a lot of flaws,
I
hard to overlook.
didn't dislike him the way I disliked King. I disliked King because you could see that everything, even when he was telling the Indians, I'm your friend. I've been your friend for 30 years. I always have your best interest, as my interest. I'm looking out for you.
You wanted him to become a better person. You wanted him to start making the right choices. And there's a point at which he does start to make the right choices, and he's going to testify against King. But then, like that, King's got him back under his thumb and having him do this thing. You're like, why do you not learn? And then, it takes the death of one of his children for him to actually turn against King. And she stands by him through all of this amazingly. Yeah. I mean, granted, she's got children with him. She does care about him, and he cares about her. And there is a genuine love there, no matter how messed up it is that he does these horrible things because he's gives into his weaknesses and the pressure from his uncle. But, so... I don't know. It's complicated. But the final end, the scene where you're talking about at the end, where she asks him, he says that she kept on telling him to tell the whole truth, and he finally does tell pretty much the whole truth. And then she comes in and she's like, "How do you feel? Did you tell the whole truth?" He's like, "I feel so much better. I have this weight lifted off of me." And then but she had one more question for him. What was it that you were giving me? Mm-hmm. And she's giving him a chance, and you wonder what would happen with a couple answers, but she knows that there was something else in there, that he wasn't giving her just insulin, or that he was giving her something that was harming her, because as soon as she was removed from that, she started getting better. So at this point, if he's really told the truth, if he's come clean, then he needs to come clean about the fact that he was adding something to her insulin that was, either drugging her or poisoning her, and he doesn't do it. He says, he's like, insulin. And that's when she walks away. And that's when, he couldn't be honest. I mean, granted, do you want to be honest about the fact that you were potentially complicit in trying to kill her as well?
Right. And again, when I saw it, I'm thinking, this guy is so naive. He thinks he's giving her insulin and he's essentially trying to kill her. But again, I didn't think that he had the hand in doing it. I think he was just doing what he thought was the right thing. But again, when you start backing it up with these other incidents where he was putting it into the drinks and stuff like that, he probably did know it.
Because he knew what the insulin was. He knew that this was an added thing. King and the doctor say, this will just calm her down. It'll make her less of a problem. Mm-hmm. So they implied it was a sedative. But I think he believed it was a sedative. I think it was really poison. And, he was slowly killing her. I don't think he was trying to kill her. I think he was trying to keep her quiet.
Yeah. Okay, so that brings us close to the end of the film. And right there, when there's the separation between Molly and Ernest, I would have been content with them just going to title cards saying, Molly and Ernest, separate she goes on to live her life and dies at a certain age. Ernest goes on to live his life, move in with his brother, whatever, lives his life. And that would have been the end. I would have seen that as closure. I didn't necessarily need to go to the radio show because I felt it was such a dramatic change. It was relevant in the sense that they did it in a 1920s style. So it was appropriate for the era that it was taking place. It was just this highly polished sequence against a very raw, out in the wilderness.
And I think this is probably another situation where, of not killing your babies. So in writing and in filmmaking in general, there's an expression called killing your babies. And that means sometimes you have to, even the idea that inspired a whole story or movie or whatever else, sometimes in the end doesn't actually serve the story. And so you have to be willing to, kill your babies, let go of that idea, remove it from the story because it doesn't enhance the story in the long run. And I think this goes back to kind of the original idea where they were going to have the whole thing set up as a true crime drama from the perspective of the precursors to the FBI. And these things, I think, actually were done, these radio plays with J. Edgar Hoover and the FBI, the true crime things. So I think this actually happened, and I think it was kind of maybe left over from that original idea, or not wanting to leave that whole thing out. But again, I didn't see anybody who really thought that helped the story. In fact, I think it detracted from the story. I mean, I kind of liked the aspect that it was because I always like to see how they did those stories, but I didn't think it really fit in this particular story, and it kind of added levity at a time which I'm not sure we really needed levity. And I mean, I guess, like, I think you said that you probably would have preferred if they just had some, plates come up saying, this is what happened to these people.
I would have totally been content with that. I would have felt that it was a nice way to wrap it up, because you're already upset when you see Ernest and Molly kind of come to that face-to-face discussion and realize, there are truths that either are or aren't being discussed. And that, wow, that's the end there. And then you find out kind of, hey, here's a title of what happens to him. Here's a title of what happens to her. That would have been okay with me, but I'm not the filmmaker, and maybe that's, part of the story. And I don't know how much the book would have influenced that last scene as well, too. So,
well, and I say these are obviously spoilers. We've kicked into that pretty hard at this point. But there's the aspect of the, they say that King Hale served 20 years and was he got life, but he was let out after 20 years, and he lived an additional 20 years or something like that. And you're thinking, wait a minute, how old was he? Because he's being played by an 80-year-old actor who would have been 120 by the time he died. In reality, he was actually, I think, in his mid to late 40s, and he died at 87 or something like that, which makes a little more sense. Same thing with, if you look at, Leonardo DiCaprio's character, he had just come back from the war. I imagine he was probably supposed to be in his
19 or 20,
early to mid 20s.
Yeah.
And instead of being played by an actor in his mid to late 40s. Granted, I don't think it took away from the story at all that they were played by much older characters, but when you start doing math in your head, it's like, wait a minute, this doesn't really make sense.
Yeah, but that's Martin Scorsese. He has this pool of talent that he works with. Again, Robert De Niro, 10 films, Leonardo DiCaprio, 6 films, going back to Gangs of New York.
It didn't really matter that much that they were older, and Leonardo DiCaprio looks a lot younger than he probably is in this. I would think. So I mean, like I say, it didn't detract from the story. It's only at the very end, and I can't help it. I always do the math in my head. I'm like, wait a minute.
Yeah, you're being super critical there on, like, well, is this possible? I understand what you're saying. Noticing inconsistency, I guess. So to conclude, Heath, what are your final thoughts on this? Having sat through it, seen the whole film, having seen the trailers prior to that, read the production notes, heard some of the interviews, what do you take out of it?
So, it's a good movie. It's an important story. I'm glad it was told. I'm glad I saw it. I do feel like it was longer than it needed to be. It was hard to watch, and I'm probably not going to watch it again anytime in the near future, just because it was hard to watch. But it was good. I'm glad I saw it. And if somebody asked me if they should see it, I would say, yeah. I'm not sure at the theater or not, but yeah. What about you? What are your thoughts?
I agree. I've already told a couple of friends and family about it, that I think it is a film that's worth seeing. It's not a story that I was familiar with because I hadn't read the book, and this is based on history, so there's always interest there. Probably brings Osage Nation into the minds of a lot of people who may not be familiar with it at all. So I think that's worthwhile in that sense. Obviously, anything that any of these filmmakers or talent are involved in tend to be films that go on to win awards and stuff. So I'm glad I saw it in that sense, looking down the road at, Oscars and stuff. What segments of it could be nominated? Could it be nominated for editing or for the soundtrack or for the acting or for the directing or even Best Picture? I think those are things that you would have to keep an eye on. I think that it will get some kind of nominations. Seeing it in the theater versus seeing it streaming, I don't know. I don't know if it necessarily made a difference, other than the fact that you could pause it and see it at your leisure. But I don't know if that's the way the film ultimately is supposed to be consumed from a filmmaker's standpoint. So I'll leave it at that.
If you enjoyed this, don't forget to subscribe to the YouTube channel, CinemaTechnica, or the website, CinemaTechnica.com. And Mark, do you want to plug?
Sure. Definitely check out postmagazine.com. We have news on the production and post-production industry all the time. We also have our print issue, Post Magazine. And if you go to the website, you can sign up for the digital issue, the print issue, some of our newsletters. You can also check out some of our YouTube videos as well. So I encourage you to check it out. And Heath, thanks for having me on.
Thanks, Mark.